I'm Jacob Moore. I'm the Assistant Director of the Templehoyne Buell Center for the Study of American Architecture here at GSAP, which is right over at Buell Hall, next to the chapel. So together with, first I need to thank Lila and Lucy and Stefan from the events office, but also the urban planning program, urban design, historic preservation, Center for Spatial Research, and all of their various team members. It was a real group effort to get this thing pulled together. In particular, as a Buell team member, I need to thank Reinhold Martin, Jordan Steingard, Eddie Almonte, Alicia French, Jajin Lin, and Maria Linares, that's the Buell team. And so just really quickly to set up, Buell Center does multi-year thematic research projects, and our current project is called Power Infrastructure in America, and it has provided some of the institutional context for the event today. So I thought I would just describe a little bit about that project before handing it off to the moderators and the presenters. So, extending and further developing 10 years of work on the interrelated materials, systems, and discourses of housing and real estate development. With Power Infrastructure in America, as you might gather from its name, the Buell Center is thinking critically about many of those same houses. But rather than walking in through the door, we're flowing in through the pipes, wires, and ducts that crisscross their thresholds, and flowing back out again to the treatment facilities, Excel sheets, and sloganeering that both define and stress those buildings' capacities. In particular, we've been interested in the ways in which emergencies, which is a hard-to-define category, but we'll leave it loose for now, in which emergencies expose infrastructures at work. Most spectacularly, sometimes during emergencies, infrastructures break down, and it's their not working that demands attention. More often, however, and usually much less spectacularly, emergencies tend to intensify and accelerate processes already long underway, literally through the infrastructures at hand. In Flint, Michigan, the executive definition and declaration of emergency financial management led to the disenfranchisement of the town's majority black population by a majority white state government, and subsequently, through, among other things, the municipality's water pipes, to at least 12 deaths and the lead poisoning of thousands more Flint residents. In New Orleans, Louisiana, concentrated poverty and constrained ecological imagination, among other things, allowed, through the city's levees, for at least 1,800 deaths and a more pernicious transformation of the region's demographics and landscape than was otherwise guaranteed. And here in New York, real estate interests, public authorities, and architects responded to nearly 3,000 deaths and the imperatives of the so-called global war on terror through, among other things, the site's slurry walls and subway tunnels with the making and monetizing of sacred ground. As of the spring and summer of 2017, the Buell Center planned to study these infrastructures and others, with special attention paid not only to their similarities, but also, importantly, to their differences, and this plan persists. However, in late September of 2017, in its bracing exposure of infrastructure at the convergence of neoliberalism, colonialism, and relentlessly warming oceans, the unnatural disaster known as Hurricane Maria has made the urgency of working across categories and across disciplines ever more clear. So in this spirit, here at this most interdisciplinary of schools, I'm going to introduce Hiba Akar, who is going to moderate together with Monxo Lopez the discussion at the end, and she'll introduce everyone else. So Hiba Akar is assistant professor here in the Department of Urban Planning at GSAP. Her recent book, For the War Yet to Come, Planning Beirut's Frontiers, which was released this year at Stanford University Press, examines how Beirut's post-Civil War peripheries have been transformed through multiple planning exercises into contested frontiers that are mired in new forms of conflict. Akar received her PhD from University of California, Berkeley, and she holds a Bachelor of Architecture from the American University of Beirut, and a Master in City Planning from Massachusetts Institute of Technology. So I'll hand it to Hiba, and she'll get us
Thank you, Jacob. Thank you for the Buell Center. I'm so glad that we're having this conversation here today because we at GSAP, with our architecture, urban planning, urban design, and historic preservation programs, strive to be at the forefront of these critical conversations and actually need to be at the forefront of these conversations of our time, especially that these natural crises are in fact very much human-made. Crises like Hurricane Maria highlight not only the detrimental effect of climate change, but also the long histories of how our fields, such as planning, architecture, development, and policy, played a primary role in the colonization, dispossession, and disinvestment and exclusion of places like Puerto Rico, rendering them unable to recover from disasters, and leading to worsening living conditions and new forms of displacement. Yet at the same time, while acknowledging these histories, we are called upon to participate in improving the living conditions before and when and after such crises happen, and to help conceive of a different future that is more inclusive, equitable, and resilient. So we have an amazing panel today here to discuss these issues, and I will go ahead and introduce our speakers. Monxo Lopez is a researcher, a professor, cartographer, and South Bronx-based environmental and urban justice activist. He teaches Latino and ethnic politics at Hunter College, and is a mapping fellow at the Design Trust for Public Spaces. Monxo also is a founding member of South Bronx Unite, a local urban and environmental justice organization, and founding member and board member of the Mott Haven Port Morris Community Land Stewards, the local community land trust. He holds a PhD in political science from CUNY's Graduate Center and an MA from Université Laval in Quebec, Canada. His academic research revolves around spatiality, mapping, social justice, political theory, and Latino communities. Lopez's political writings on spatial and social justice have been published in Salon, Latino Rebels, and NACLA, among other media outlets, and his activist work has been profiled by New York Times, Urban Omens, and Correo de la Sera. He was born and grew up in Puerto Rico and currently lives in Mott Haven, the South Bronx. Next, we move to Ivis Garcia Zambrana is an assistant professor in city and metropolitan planning at the University of Utah. He has spent time as a professional in planning in Albuquerque, New Mexico, San Francisco, California, Springfield, Missouri, Washington, D.C., and Chicago, where she was the co-chair of the city's larger Puerto Rican organization, the Puerto Rican Agenda. She's currently writing a book on Puerto Ricans in Chicago, which is under contract with Centro Press. Dr. Garcia also chairs Plannings for Puerto Rico, a group of academic and practitioner planners from ACSP, APA, FREMA, Centro, UPR, and Society for Puerto Rican Planner, among others that are collaborating in recovery efforts in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria. She was recently elected a board member of the National Puerto Rican Agenda, which is a nonpartisan alliance to address Puerto Rico's humanitarian crisis and promote Puerto Rican political and civic participation in the United States. She earned her PhD in urban and civic participation in urban planning and policy from the University of Illinois at Chicago. She holds dual degrees from the University of New Mexico in community and regional planning and Latin American studies, and bachelor in environmental sciences from Inter-American University of Puerto Rico. Marcelo López-Dinardi is an immigrant, researcher, and educator interested in the various tales of design, in the practice of architecture as research, and the intersection of architecture and political economy. He's an assistant professor of architecture at Texas A&M University. As partner of an A office, was selected to represent the United States Pavilion in the 2016 Venice Architecture Biennale, and later selected as a fellow for Idea Cities Athens an event organized by the New York City New Museum. Has written for April Review, the Architect newspaper, Domos, Planning Perspectives, Art Forum China, and lectured at Cooper Union, Princeton University's BRIS, among others. He completed a bachelor in architecture from the Polytechnic University of Puerto Rico and an MS in critical, creator, and conceptual practice of architecture here at Columbia GSAP. Martin Brass is the Director of Community Relations and Research at the Vieques Conservation and Historical Trust and the co-founder of Vieques Love. Both are non-profits. His research focuses on I'm not going to be able to say that. Bioluminescence. Okay, cool. Baseball and sea turtles with the White Vise Laboratory. After Maria, Martin took a leadership role on the emergency response and recovery by connecting outside resources and local entities to provide solutions. He became a facilitator and coordinator for the complex response system, providing logistics, resources, translation, and coordination for government and private entities. He is an EPA Environmental Champion recipient, a member of the board of SCANTIS, and the president of the board of Greco Silva and Educational Foundation. Andrés Mignucci is a Puerto Rican architect, urbanist, and educator. He is the recipient of the National Architecture Prize in Architecture, a fellow of the American Institute of Architects, and the Henry Club Award Literate. His recent publications include Conversations with Forms, Supports Housing and City, and Bruno Stegno on Architecture for the Tropics. Mignucci has been selected as the Rockefeller Foundation Arts and Literary Arts Fellow and 2019 Scholar in Resident at the Villaggio Center, developing a research project entitled Common Ground, Public Space, and the Resilient City. Mignucci teaches at the School of Architecture at the University of Puerto Rico and is principal of Andrés Mignucci's Architecture. Francis Negrón-Muntaner is a filmmaker, writer, curator, scholar, and professor at Columbia University, where she's also founding curator of the Latino Arts and Activism Archive. Among her books and publications are Puerto Pop, Puerto Ricans and the Latinization of American Culture, the Latino Media Cap, and Sovereign Acts, Contesting Colonialism in Native Nations and Latinx America. Her most recent films include Small City Big Change, War from Guam, and Life Outside. For her work as a scholar and filmmaker, Negrón-Muntaner has received 4 Truman Rockefeller and Poe Fellowships. In 2008, the United Nations Rapid Response Media Mechanism recognized her as a global expert in the areas of mass media and Latino American studies. She's also the recipient of the Lenses Award, one of Colombia's most prestigious recognition for excellence in teaching and scholarship. She has also served as the director for the study of ethnicity and race from 2009 to 2016. And lastly, Ingrid Olivo is an urban planner and architect with over 20 years experience combining policy and advisory work, research and teaching. She was recently an associate researcher for Colombia's Center for Urban Disaster Risk Reduction and Resilience and an Urban Studies Foundation postdoctoral fellow, and is currently a coordinator with Ecuador's Sustainable Secondary Cities Program. Olivia has worked with NGOs, private firms, universities, multinational and public institutions, receiving support from institutions such as the British Council, Fulbright, UNESCO, Organization of American States. She has received her doctorate from urban planning from Columbia GSA. So, amazing panel, welcome. Please join me in welcoming them.
Hi everybody.
Hello.
Yes. So, I'm going to start from a strange place. For the French Algerian writer and philosopher Albert Camus, the only important philosophical question was suicide. Was life worth living given the injustices, the cruelty, the pain, and the patent absurdity surrounding all of us? For Camus, the response was always yes. Struggle was always the only option. But is that the case with the situation in Puerto Rico? I'm going to be a little bit dramatic, but this is what I think the situation in Puerto Rico boils down to. Is Puerto Rico worth saving and fighting for? I'm not talking about Puerto Ricans, because obviously we are human beings, and Puerto Ricans, like every other human being on the planet, have rights, and we are supposed to possess human rights. But are Puerto Ricans worth saving in Puerto Rico? Is Puerto Rico worth saving for Puerto Ricans? Is saving and fighting for Puerto Rico and saving and fighting for Puerto Ricans the same thing? These are uncomfortable questions, existential questions, and I think that some of the possible answers to those questions are already out there, and many of us do not like what we hear. The massive exodus pre- and post-Maria signals precisely at the decoupling of Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans. It reminds us, one more time, that you can save one and let the other go down under. That we can save Puerto Ricans, meaning have massive numbers of refugees, while saving the island, apparently, for non-Puerto Ricans. Why does this feel possible? It feels so likely. It is the plan that doesn't include us, but it also feels so wrong. I think that the answer is because we automatically couple people and places. For the simple reason that people usually build the places they habitate. In most colonial cases, however, this equation of people and places is not as straightforward. And Puerto Rico is a colonial case. Infrastructure, the built infrastructure and the institutional infrastructure of colonies does not work in normal ways. In colonies, infrastructure is hardwired to produce colonial subjects and reproduce colonial dynamics. And again, given that Puerto Rico and its infrastructure is in general of a colonial nature, the question is again, is this infrastructure worth saving and fighting for? Can we really delink the colonial aspect from our infrastructures? Can we build truly decolonial things from within a thoroughly colonial environment? The answer to this might be complicated, but I believe it must be yes. Today we need to sketch potential ways to transmute the colonial into the decolonial, to transmute dependency into independence, and to try to answer the question of why and how Puerto Rico must be safe for Puerto Ricans and for other of our brothers and sisters from the Caribbean. It means that we must begin our conversation fully aware of the colonial stew, la sopa colonial, as they call it, that in which we find ourselves. The key operative word here is work. Because most folks I know, and most activists I know, can recite the colonial land release of what's wrong in Puerto Rico by heart. What we need to have a conversation is, the real crisis for me, is not a crisis of information. We know in general what's going on in Puerto Rico. The crisis revolves around what, how, and why we are built, or we're gonna unbuild, whatever needs to be built or unbuilt in Puerto Rico. This is why a talk about infrastructure is important, because I feel it frames our discussion around a trope of action rather than around a trope of information and data. Information and data are important, and the more we have, the better. Yet, I think that we know most of what we need to know to get our outrage and organizing going. I am known as a kind of internal joke by some people as Monxo Watts, okay? Right after the hurricane, I got called by my sister, asking me, she told me that she was going through an asthma attack, and she told me like the oil generators are gonna kill me. So I need you to find out about how solar works. I need you to build a prototype, an inexpensive one. I want you to gather like all the information, all the know-how you can, so we can like share that information in Puerto Rico. When I started doing this, I didn't know anything about solar, about watts, about amperage, about volts, nothing of the sort. But this last week, with the knowledge, the know-how that I acquired, I was installing like a rather large solar array system in a community garden in the South Bronx, based on the knowledge of that I acquired while working in Puerto Rico. While I worked on that prototype, I thought about what I was doing from an overly political perspective. I tried to think about my efforts within a decolonial frame. I wrote about it, I polished some stuff about it, but my main emphasis was, and will remain, organizing action to change the material conditions that, to paraphrase your Lipsitz, determine how dependence takes place. Meaning I want to investigate and act on how the built environment reproduces dependence. The key here is that I was in Puerto Rico in August, and the natural infrastructure, is doing just fine. What is still down and not working as it should work is the built infrastructure. And so we need to somehow figure out how to reproduce in a way not only the resiliency, but the redundancy and the fortitude of that natural infrastructure that was, in a way, has evolved around hurricanes. Like we were traumatized by the hurricane, but somehow our nature wasn't. I think that one of our insights that living in the diaspora gives us is how planning and architecture have been used here in our cities to breed dependence and displacement from the top. The planning is done to us here in the cities. I am personally involved in efforts here and in Puerto Rico to organize communities around community land trusts, fideicomisos, mechanisms that allow communities to develop the tools for planning and building their own infrastructures. I'm sure that our panelists today will give us food for thought on these matters about different modalities of planning, recovery efforts, etc. Also, there is the question of preservation and the archive. What do the archives of wounded places like Puerto Rico look like? Can we have a healthy archive in a place that is emptying out? I believe I'm not the only one to feel that our recent massive exodus from Puerto Rico is the wound that subsumes all other wounds. The exodus is, in a sense, the metonymy for the sad state of the island. How bad is the situation in the island? People ask me, I usually reply, hundreds of thousands of people have left since the hurricane. It is difficult to shake off the impression that this exodus that sometimes helps individuals and individual families survive is at the same time an open wound that prefigures what Frances calls the emptying island, la isla que se vacía scenario. Puerto Rico without Puerto Ricans, or paradise for developers. It is for that reason that I'm convinced that our diasporas are an essential part of the conversation about Puerto Rico, that our experiences here are relevant and might be helpful in dealing with the situation down in Puerto Rico and vice versa, that our refugees and the conditions under which they have fled have lots to teach us about the potential roads of action for our diasporic communities here in the US. A conversation on the legal, human, and built infrastructure in Puerto Rico is a necessary one, both for the future of Puerto Rico, but also for the sake of building healthy communities here in exile. I'm going to end with a personal note. Like, I am from Puerto Rico, and one of the things that I'm my time is up, that I'm really concerned about is the idea that we don't let ourselves and the history of our island be defined by the tragedy of the hurricane. I think that it's important that we talk about what happened. I think that we are all, in a way, in treatment, and talking about it is a way of walking through that trauma. That being said, I feel it's really, really important that we don't let ourselves be defined by this, and that we allow ourselves to be defined by the way that we are responding not only to the tragedy of the hurricane, but also to the human-made catastrophe, the man-made catastrophe of the financial crisis in the island. Thank you.
So I guess today I'm going to talk about housing as infrastructure. I don't know if you guys know that of the $100 billion that Puerto Rico will receive, there's like about 30% or $31 billion that are going to go to housing. So they're going to go to economic development, to general infrastructure. It's like twice as much that is going to go for the electric bill. But in particular, I'm going to be talking about informal housing and how people were not able to prove ownership. So I will give like a little bit of background about informal housing in Puerto Rico, some case studies of people that were not able to obtain assistance from FEMA, and then some policy recommendations. In terms of the methods, I joined the Disaster Recovery Coalition. They have like weekly calls from the National Income Housing Coalition.
And I worked previously with them, and like through them I met Ayuda Legal, Huracán Maria. You probably heard of them. And once I went to Puerto Rico, I'm going to be there for a year. I went to the public workshops and have conversations with them, and they have been using some case studies. So there's different case studies, some of them that they use for media and other ones. So the question is like how the requirement for proof of ownership in the applications or the appeals of FEMA individual and household grants became a barrier for thousands of Puerto Ricans who live in untitled or land or homes. And most importantly, it's like how this barrier could be overcome. So to give you some background, there's 1.2 million homes in Puerto Rico, and 92 of those receive like some damages. So in terms of like a lot of damages, like more like 300,000 and 70,000 that were like completely lost homes. Then of those that applied for FEMA, it was like 98%, and those could be for also like personal property. In terms of like the decisions of FEMA, 40% were approved, so that's like 1.39 billion in grants. That means that 60% were not approved. There was like 30% that were ineligible and 30% that were denied. And of course you can always appeal, but even for people who appeal, 18% were approved and 82% were not. So that's like an eligibility rate of like 75%. So there's the scale of formality in Puerto Rico. So there's a lot of informal construction with no permits and non-conformance in land use codes. That's about like 45 to 55%. So there's different ranges, and 20% of people do not have any deeds. There could be like 41 codes that people could be denied, insufficient damages, or like there was some kind of persisting condition. People simply could not be contacted on the phone, or when they sent a letter, they didn't get it. There was also inconsistency, like some people have electric bills in one address, they have phone bills in another address, and no proof of ownership is about 15%. So in terms of informal practices, you might divide them in like building, but also like occupying. It could be with permission or without, right? So for without permission, it's like rescue land, that's how people call it. And most of the times it's like city-owned. But it could also be that you build a home where your family has land, or maybe you have permission from the government or from an NGO to be there. In terms of occupying, it could be a taking, or you can be a heir. There's something else that is the good faith. So that means that somebody told you that it was okay to live in this place, and you believe them. It could be related to you or not. So a little bit of more background, because there's also informal housing in the United States, and there was a case from Mac Waters versus FEMA. It was a lawsuit of residents of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, and in this case, FEMA denied them assistance based on them having like the same address or also sharing a phone. And then the court decided that FEMA was right because they were just trying to prevent fraudulent duplication or fraudulent behavior, and the recommendation was that they should be more inclusive in the future and ask for their documentation. So these are like some people that were denied of assistance. We have, for example, Fernando, and he bought this land like 20 years ago. He built his own home, but he bought it like for $1,500, and there was no contract. And this happens a lot in Puerto Rico. There's no contract at all. There could be a verbal agreements. There's Roberto that he lives in the home that his mother used to have, but his mother passed away. There's other ways that you can also try to prove ownership, and might be like through electric bills or water bills, but he kept the water and electric bills under his mother. Then we have this very common case, which is the land segregation. So you have multiple homes in like a single family land. And in this case, a lot of people got just $500 for their damages in in their home, so it could be more like treated as a renter that lost some things, but could not really fix their homes. There's some cases in where people are in unrelated land, so it's not land that belongs to the family, but this, for example, is Jose's case that his mother built a land in the, it was his grandfather's employer. And this was like a agreement between gentlemen 50 years ago, so he could not prove that this was his home. This also happens a lot in where you have two households in one family, so you just build on top of like some other house. And in this case, there's like two brothers, and because of this rule of the shared house rule, the brother got assistance because he sent the application first. But then his brother, Waldemar, could not get assistance because he was, again, trying to prevent fraudulent behavior. They could not prove that they are a separate nuclei. There's other cases like in Vieques del Sol. This is like 221 families live in this community that 50 years ago the government took them from informal settlements and then say, you know, it's okay to live in this housing for land that belongs to us, and there was an NGO that was taking care of the land. But again, these families cannot prove that they are owners. In terms of like the policy, so the lawyers from the National Income Housing Coalition, what they were doing is like trying to look at what were some of the definitions of ownership in the United States in terms of like federal law, and also look at Puerto Rico as treated as a state. In the US, you could be the legal owner, but also you cannot have no title, but then prove that you are maintaining a place or you are paying taxes, and also you could be a heir. So based on this, the federal law should be able to, they should be able to prove they are owners. So there was a creation of a sworn statement, and this was actually creation also with like people from FEMA. And it was approved in August 6, and it doesn't have to be notarized. So that was like a major thing because in Puerto Rico, the notaries, you cannot go to the FedEx, right? You have to get a lawyer to like sign this for you. And then you could provide several supporting documents in any way that you could to prove like maintenance, inheritance, or possession. However, this was not a FEMA document. So what that meant? It meant that they put a press release, but they didn't attach the form. It meant that they didn't train the DRC staff on the availability of this. They just like presented like this is another alternative, and then all the work of like passing around this and telling people, it was on the non-profits like Ayuda Legal Maria, which is mostly volunteers. So this is what they are doing. They're like, I have gone back and forward with FEMA staff to get them to notify staff, to train staff on the form, to notify the applicants. They also have tried to see if they can get the addresses of people, the phone numbers, so they can call them, and they have got them to try to extend the deadline. The next step is they're looking into like a class lawsuit to see if they actually can get them to do these things. In terms of other policy solutions, of the $18.5 billion that will come to Puerto Rico in the form of CDBG-DR funds, $40 million are going to go to give titles to people. The government already received 10 proposals for this. We don't know, like, who are those? Maybe some of you know that. It's kind of kept secret. And then the idea is that they will actually give titles to 48,000 people that the government knows that do not have any titles. So thank you very much.
So, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks to GS Happy Bill Center and all the organizers for the invitation. I'm super happy to be back. I'm going to talk about debt, text, and images and how they perform as infrastructure in the Puerto Rico current scenario. with specialized in debt, a visual audit, an ongoing project. I've been trying to understand Puerto Rico's debt in order to localize it. It was inevitable to consider this within the context of the 130 years of Puerto Rico's history under the ruling of the United States. I want to start with this map, the first of the ones I made and will be presented today, that shows an overall timeline of US presidents' visits to Puerto Rico in order to stress the tension between territory, legal frameworks, and their impact. There have been 6 official visits out of 21 presidents, some of them lasting less than 4 hours, some for fundraising, and some unofficial visits as layovers or to vacation. Overall, the official visit does not sum more than 200 hours or the equivalent of a 40 hours full-time work week. However, the impact they have had on the island currently extends indefinitely in time. At the bottom, a yellow bar shows the extent of the current debt that I will briefly recount. I've also inevitably encountered things visually, which has been one form of constructing cultural imaginaries, I will suggest, as infrastructural products themselves. The Spanish-American War coincided with the booming of yellow journalism, which produced a great amount of imagery that in many ways cast to impress ideas of these other territories, factual or not, and circulated media in general served as a principal tool to learn about them. The Judge magazine cover of August of 1895 shows the map as image, as powerful narrative building image, combining territorial coordinates and visual imagery. Puerto Rico, the center of this discussion, is not included in it. This image precedes the Spanish-American War, where Puerto Rico was perhaps a shadow, an extra more than a main cast character. Cartoons also circulated beyond New York. This time Puerto Rico was included with a map comeback. However, these images started to acquire a graded reality at every step. Men seated at tables in remote places formalized these realities and circulated for everyone's knowledge. Puerto Rico has been ceded to the United States by the Crown of Spain as part of the closing transaction of the Spanish-American War. The teaching cartoon began. A class in civilization is taught by Uncle Sam to the new students who, beyond consent, as clearly stated in the illustration's blackboard on the right, are taught in a room including a physical earth globe, colonized subjects, and obedient states. Again, the cartoon materialized. Stories about the new possessions were being implemented in school curricula in the US, reproducing colonial histories through the sight and imagination of those in power. The image construction continues, imagining not only a territory, but a subject who is a businessman and prosper, or the early stages of the supremacy of financial entrepreneurship. New maps were created to document the sources for extraction, like agricultural plantation maps, or military enclaves and communications infrastructure, among others. But I would like to zoom out now to guide you through a visual timeline of some of the critical moments of the story of text, images, and maps. First in Paris, France, signing the agreement of Puerto Rico's fate in 1898, then the Forfeit Act of 1900, signed at the US Congress in Washington, establishing a civilian government for the island. In 1917, the people of Puerto Rico were assigned US citizenship, with restrictions of representation, but not military duties, like serving in war. It was also under the Jones-Schaeffer Act that a triple tax exemption was created at the local, state, and federal level for American business interested in Puerto Rico. 1920 followed with the Merchant Marine Act that conditioned, in the context of an island, that every ship with goods coming into and out of Puerto Rico must happen in a US-made vessel under a US company and always through a US port. 1952 formalized the ambivalence of Puerto Rico's status quo by the hand of the first locally elected governor, Luis Marín. Puerto Rico was allowed to craft its own constitution, giving the island an apparent sovereignty and autonomy from its ruler. However, no single clause was entered in the constitution. In the case the government of Puerto Rico do not have enough money to keep itself running, it must first pay its creditors before any public provision. In 1976, an economic incentive was created for developing jobs through another tax reduction program known as the Section 936, opening high-skilled jobs in the island for locally educated people and great benefit for the US companies who decided to set up operations there, particularly the pharmaceutical industry. Later in 1984, a low-key revision to the bankruptcy code redefined the concept of territory making it specific for the 50 states, excluding Puerto Rico. During the 10-year period from 1996 to 2006, the Section 96 program was phased out eliminating thousands of jobs in the island, and was also a period where the debt grew significantly. In late 2006, Puerto Rico inaugurated a sales tax to help palliate its deficit, passing the growing burden onto its residents. This tax was defined under PROFINA, which is the Spanish acronym for Puerto Rico Virgin Interest Fund Corporation. That eventually added around 22% to the total debt. This sales tax in PROFINA was in part designed by a Goldman Sachs representative 2 years before the 2008 crash. Money was taken to keep the government running, privatization of infrastructure, massive layoffs happened all during the last administration. Notwithstanding, the US debt and its ceiling in blue kept rising, and it is expected to surpass $20 trillion by the end of this year. Puerto Rico eventually ran out of money to keep operating, and its constitution forced them to pay creditors first. There was no money for them either. This takes us to 2014, when the last of those administrations issued $3.5 billion in bonds. Immediately, 275 companies from all over the world responded. These bonds were explicitly noted as high risk, and hedge managers did not wait to react. However, the big majority of them were transactions from companies distributed across the US, with a big concentration in the East Coast. It is no surprise that the biggest concentration of those were in New York City, with major participants in Lower Manhattan, but consolidated mostly in Midtown. Years ago, Saskia Sasson was discussing the liquidity of finance in the context of the newest thin and tall skyscrapers in Midtown Manhattan, and that we needed to ground that money. Puerto Rico's debt might be somehow different, but I have persisted to ground it first in the island's territory before framing it within the context it belongs to, under the umbrella of the US financial system. I will, however, ground that money on the island as well as this project continues. But when we look at this map, consider that 44% of Puerto Ricans live under the poverty rate established by the US, and of those, 28% live with under $10,000 a year. Midtown Manhattan's median income is a minimum of $200,000, with a large concentration of much more. A median cost per house or condo is $1 million, and with at least an 80% white population. In 2016, the US Congress passed the PROMESA Act, signed by President Obama, the Puerto Rico Oversight, Management, and Economic Stability Act, in which an oversight board takes supreme control over the island provisions. The island's undeniable colonial condition had yet again clearly resurfaced. But this transaction happened also in the register of words and images. Words and images that are also hegemonic, infrastructural, mostly as products of the supremacy of finance, they impact governments and individuals alike, including those who are willingly subjected to the colonial mandate and have embodied the proper business map of the 1900 cartoon. Others have not shown, and others have responded and resisted from every possible front. Yet there are key actors and players who help us understand these asymmetries. As an example, Mark Roski from Aurelius Capital, one of the current hedge fund holders of debt, argues not jokingly that the oversight board imposed on Puerto Rico is unconstitutional, and that he prefers to follow the mandate at his benefit of the Puerto Rico Constitution. The same figure had benefited in the past from betting against the crash of Argentina. But the debt keeps moving and circulates rearranged within Midtown and Lower Manhattan. This is the late 2017 status of the debt transaction and its locations that will soon be mapped. However, these transactions and these operations, at least these days, are not individual actions. A month ago, the US Treasury Secretary Stephen Mnuchin just announced the creation of opportunity zones, in which, as it broadly circulates in the Wall Street Journal, the entire territory of Puerto Rico is an opportunity zone. There are no formal cartoons included in this news. Perhaps there's no more irony needed. There is, however, a photograph of the instrumentalization of architecture as a product of real estate, and men signing documents in Washington. Among the Treasury Secretary past collaborators and a crucial figure of the 2008 housing crisis is the New York City billionaire John Paulson, who also participated in the 2014 Puerto Rico bonds transaction, made billions from the 2008 housing crisis, and have increased his presence in the island acquiring hotels, resorts, and real estate development. Mr. Paulson, one of the field continued working with, was an economic advisor for Donald Trump's presidential campaign, and worked with now Secretary Mignucci as hedge fund manager back in 2008. He owns the refurbished and expanded Vanderbilt Hotel in Condado, Puerto Rico, who now appeals to its old glory of 1919, when the hotel opened to European and Hollywood royalty. His San Regis resort, also in Puerto Rico, like a military enclave, happily reproduced and construct narrative in his plantation house, the hallmark of early 1900 colonial extraction and exploitation. For a few, everything is okay, or todo bien, as read the colorful painting on the restaurant's wall. Puerto Rico's debt, its infrastructure, is not only to be audited from within by local agents scrutinizing every penny to hold their elected officials accountable, but also from without, with text, images, and maps, perhaps starting in Manhattan's Midtown.
Hola, my name is Mark Martin Bras. I come from Vieques, Puerto Rico, and I call it an island in the wind because it's kind of how it felt. First of all, I don't know where you've been to Vieques or not, but it's a municipality of Puerto Rico, which is a commonwealth, and we're U.S. citizens in a way. And in the sense of the colonial aspects, we would be like a colony of Puerto Rico too, if you consider the way that things went down in Vieques. We're about 9,000 people. We're isolated by water, which is something that during this response was looked at as this imaginable, unsurpassable way to treat or fix a place. But then you consider all the other islands that I've done, and you consider how far Hawaii is, you know, it doesn't seem that hard. Weirdly, our water and energy, it comes from the main island, Puerto Rico, underwater to our west coast, until Maria hit, right? We have a very complex history. You probably remember more than anything the military occupation and the bombing that happened and the civil disobedience that came an international movement on a very small island. We have gone through a lot of different stages in our history, and we were in a real estate and tourism boom right before Maria that brought obviously economic development, but an immense danger if you consider we had an island that still held some of the greatest things an island should have. Then Maria hit, and everything became very different. You can see the development of Vieques. It's 21 miles by 4.5 miles because this was military, and then monoculture of sugar came before. The development of the towns was in the middle. And they gave some of this land back when the Navy left. We have weird transportation systems that are inconsistent at best. And we have one of the poorest education systems in all of Puerto Rico, which is one of the poorest in all the United States. We have a very limited amount of services, and when the emergency hit, we were completely unprepared. We were out there for weeks without having anybody from the central government of Puerto Rico or from FEMA even step foot on the island. And we were in shock. What Monxo is saying is we're in therapy because we lived a really hard shock that took a lot of people, including the local government, out. And so you have people, oceanographers, and you have teachers, and you had technical difficulties that had to step up and do the job of people that were just simply in their homes, that didn't know exactly what they could do. The recovery was very slow at best, and it was an exercise in inefficiency. I cannot tell you how many times we had assessments. People come over in helicopters with teams of 10, 20 to 5 times for the hospital generator to assess it, and then they got the wrong one. We had a structure that was just really hard to organize, and if it wasn't for the private groups, I don't know what would have happened to Vieques. Weeks without any interaction. Language barriers, the administrative process was a failure, but the ego is something we should not ignore, because it was a huge part of the problem, and still is a huge part of the problem, and it's part of the problem of the people that also are trying to bring solutions. Because they don't understand that they're trying to help people that do have power and knowledge and skills. They're not this bunch of idiots in a corner that can't do anything, therefore they need help. They may not have the resources, but the better aspect would be to empower them. This did not work at all. It was a total chaos at all levels, and still is. And we're still living some of it. Without power today, I woke up, I got email, oh, all power, completely, 100% out in Vieques. What happened? We don't know. So one of the infrastructure problems we had was communication. We had no power in the island. We had people bringing mini inverters. We had almost mob mentality. We ran out of gas. We ran out of diesel. We ran out of water. We had limited food. We ran out of medicine in the hospital, and then the hospital had to be closed because it was damaged. So we had the undersea cable situation. And that we'll get to back again a little bit. We had Tesla come in. One of the few cases where that corporate infusion came, whether they did it for this reason or that other reason, they did power a lot of the essential things on the island and were offered. Actually went to the Puerto Rico government and said, I'm sure with financial interest as well and PR interest, said, we'll power the whole island. Take us 8 months. In October, we'll do it, sure. You'll pay me, we'll give you a discounted rate, we'll look great. I'll be Elon Musk powering Vieques Island, Tesla, you know. They said no. And still we're powered by generators which are running at about $22,000 a day. And they just shut off today, right? Completely unsustainable, making people have asthma attacks, etc. The incompatibility of some of the answers has led to a lot of thinking and a lot of assistance. We are in a situation now, power-wise, where Vieques could become really fantastic in a way, in terms that it could have a hybrid solar system, it could have the smartest grid, because one of the things that I want to instill is that places like this could become a model, if it's a model for the people there. And that we're waiting on all these situations to happen, but as of today, none are signed. The housing, well, 350 houses completely destroyed, and we had a confusion about what we could do. We had people with a lot of money saying, we'll fix the house, and people were going, no. They asked for money. It's duality, that's fraud. We'll take them to court. It's like, but they're getting water inside their house, they're getting asthma, they got mold. No, you have to wait for the decision. And we had a lot of problems in that, but there's still people living in tents on the beach. Not this one, but another one. They're still in some of these situations. And the Blue Dart program is, I don't know how it was in Puerto Rico, but completely another fix in Vieques. And I bring to you that part of the answers in solutions after a hurricane is that people have to see it. They ignoring the culture and the ignoring of how the people live in a place and the nature of a place, which is fantastic, by the way, is exercise in failure. I can't tell you how many solutions, how much money was spent, how many things were brought without getting local knowledge of people like this. Food-wise, we had incredible problems, and all these solutions that came that did not consider the local people, so it didn't work. Money wasted. So it leads us to believe that rather than to come and establish what should happen on these islands and their culture and everything like that, you should empower the people there to be ready. And that's something that really wasn't done. Big fishing community, hey, help them get the things to fish. Big tourism community, help get them out. This also transfers into what happens when you have all these things going on really good, and then you get this. And people don't like to see it anymore because it's kind of like, oh, well, you know, yes, the drama and all this kind of thing, but it's really what people went through. And it's really what they had to deal with afterwards. And in Vieques, we had emergency service, you know, completely limited. This is our roads right in front of the coastline. We were without power for about 8 months in a way, but we're still without power today. And we had people doing the work, basically. The reality of what we saw was that nobody was ready for this. We didn't know about it, and so we had to go and create new systems, create new solutions for it. I go forward because my time is running out. But what we work with is environmental, and what we're thinking is, you know, what you have to do is to get people in skill transfer and to train. Colombia, for example, got involved through the studio, and that's one case where they said, okay, we'll do a Vieques initiative, we'll go there. Did they come and say, hey, we'll plan and we'll give you the answer? No, we talked to the people. We spent the time seeing what everybody needed and tried to develop. And what happens is that we were there in a room. And in the room, the mayor, vice mayor, all these people are there, and we're all fighting. There's like a communal anger going on. And suddenly, the Columbia students came, we're trying to do this thing and we want to know, and everybody changed. And it was a virtuous exchange because it wasn't an overlapping thing trying to go over and tell us what to do. It was an interaction that they wanted to know. And it helped us look at it in a different way. And so we're happy that they came down and we're still working on that. We are working on different models. I think that's a key of islands like Vieques. In Puerto Rico, the complexity of it does not allow for an easy visual model of how we should live in terms of the infrastructure of water, energy, food, safety, and all that. So we're trying to create reliable, resilient centers like this so that people can come and actually transfer that skill from all over the world without trying to overpower the island like in Vieques. Because Vieques right now is in a very precarious situation because of what you all heard about all these people. Everybody's saying, well, it's beautiful, you saw it. It's cheap now. We can buy. We can take over. We can have this situation. We have zero education by high school in Vieques. So there's an exodus of people who want to further along. So the skill transfer, I think, is something that has to go around with any infrastructure aspect. And I think it's a model for the world. Same as it's a microcosm of what's happening in Puerto Rico and all that you heard. It is a microcosm to what's happening to the world in terms of climate change and environmental considerations that have to be done. So what I think we should do is not forget, like what you were saying, when we were having the hurricane, everybody was in a complete shock. As soon as you plug the electricity back in, there's a certain regressing back to that level. This is a time where we just have to make a stop. In our case with Maria, but we plan to amplify that to the world to realize that if you do not go the environmental way, it's just going to keep on happening all throughout. And there's a series of political, and there's a series of economical drivers that are changing that. But there is a human factor that can help them make a model. We think Vieques is visible enough on a right scope that we can show the world a better way. Thank you.
Okay, first I want to thank Columbia University for the invitation. You know, it's a privilege to be here, and it's a privilege to be with such a fantastic panel. What I want to do today is really share a number of questions and observations that come about as a result of the event of the hurricane. Obviously, this is it, you know? And there are two slides that I want to show right after because I think that just to recapitulate, they are important. And this is Puerto Rico the day before the hurricane, you know? And this is right after. The magnitude of the implications of an event like this are absolutely extraordinary in terms of how it shapes the lives and the things that you take for granted as part of sort of your everyday routine, your everyday experience. This is the town of Manatí. And this we've already talked about. The issue is that there certainly has been an interest and a concentration on the idea of infrastructure as hard infrastructure. And that's obviously very, very important, you know, particularly when the whole country is without power. But one of the things that I would like to put forward as part of this presentation is the idea of looking at public space and that component of our physical built environment, the public realm, as a fundamental infrastructure. And it is one that certainly the government has not paid attention to because they were concentrating on issues of power and water supply and all this. Now, if we think of public space, not necessarily as the gardens and plazas and parks, but really as that public realm that we share as citizens, including streets and sidewalks, and certainly the parks and the common spaces, which are very, very, very important, particularly in our Latin Caribbean culture, it is something that has been dramatically changed as a result of the hurricane. And what I have began to observe is that as a result of the hurricane, our appropriation of public space started changing. Obviously, we have to manage, in the first days after the hurricane, the idea of mobility, the way that we move about the city had to be reassessed, and there's a dramatic, I don't know if you made the stop, but this is on the way up to Calle, Just imagine the idea of a country that loses its trees in one day. It's absolutely extraordinary, So, I want to put forward three sort of ideas to rethink the nature of public space. And it partially comes from my own experience, because I had dedicated a good part of my life as an architect in designing public spaces. There's one of my public spaces in San Juan, El Parque del Indio, very, very nice Caribbean public space, very well used, etc. And here we see it with its grove of palms. And then I got this photograph on my telephone. So as an architect, I'm confronted with sort of my own architecture, just putting it sort of personally, and what that architecture represents to the public, and having myself to reassess the work that I have done and the way that I have done it, and saying there has to be something different. From now on, we cannot keep on doing things the same way that we have. So a little bit to Monxo's question about, is it worth saving Puerto Rico for Puerto Ricans? The answer is no, if that answer is in the same way that we have always done it. But the answer is yes, if we can start thinking of fundamental paradigm shifts in the way that Puerto Rico's, and if we concentrate on the built environment, in the way that Puerto Rico's built environment sort of operates. So, with the idea of common ground, and how do we reassess the notion of public space as part of our ability to build a resilient city or a resilient country, I've been observing sort of three conditions that sort of interest me. The first was the shift in the way that people use space, public space, as healing space. The second has to do with this construction of sustainable mobility, sort of a larger infrastructure of the way that we move and experience within the city, and most fundamentally the idea of public space as democratic space. And just to go through these very, very quickly, I know that time's cut them off. People started looking at public space as a way to share, as a place to share, as a place to get assistance. So there is physical healing space, but there is also emotional healing space. It was the place to go and get information. Have you heard from the town of Arjuntas? How can we get materials or supplies to this place or this place? Do you know about my family? Have you seen my cousin? So this idea, this broader idea of public space as healing space became very, very important. And the comfort that finally, after some days of not having food or not being able to find the food in the supermarkets, I can get it here. So that sort of reappropriation of public space as healing space is important. The second is the idea of sustainability. And obviously, there are these fundamental problems about how do we move within the city in a moment of environmental crisis. But when I started looking after this and seeing, for example, a place like El Tren Urbano, the urban train in San Juan, the public transport, and if you take the urban train with a fantastic investment in stations and sort of the capacity of the train to move, if you think about the way that you get from the train station out to the destination, let's say the University of Puerto Rico, etc., you see that the public realm in normal conditions is completely inadequate. It's completely unsustainable in terms of facilitating the way that people move within the city. So when it collapses, then these things sort of come to the surface. So that second component that I think that we have to relook is the idea of sustainable mobility, in whatever form it takes. And finally, the idea of public space as democratic space. And democratic space implies that there have to be certain physical qualities embedded in the public realm that ensure accessibility, that ensure inclusiveness, that ensure the possibility that people of different backgrounds and different religions and different sort of economic classes are able to share this without the general stigmas of exclusion and of separation and all of these other things. So these are the behavior of space and the ability to be together in space is sort of a lesson in itself. And obviously there's the reappropriation of creating new public spaces. And how do you assimilate the idea of transforming space as sort of a collective gesture. And these are events that happen in public space. For example, there is the Orquesta Sinfónica giving free concerts in public spaces and in community centers, etc., as part of that healing process. And finally, just to conclude, Hurricane Maria happened 2 weeks after Harvey, 3 days after Irma, right after the banks of the Seine were flooding, the wildfires in California. So this is not alone a Puerto Rican sort of situation. And I think that there are certainly lessons in Puerto Rico that have to be looked at in cities worldwide and look at certainly the capacity of public space to sort of build common ground for all of us. Thank you very much.
Well, first of all, I want to thank everyone involved in this invitation. I've been working kind of on something obsessively for a few months, so this is great to come out and talk to other people. Before I start, though, I want to say that I decided not to actually talk a lot about the piece that Monxo was mentioning, the Epinano, is going to come out soon. But I do feel compelled to say three things, or three conclusions from that piece that speak to a question he posed about Puerto Rico being saved. And the first thing about emptying that I found in my piece is that the experience of growth, of population growth, is actually an anomaly in the last 520 years in Puerto Rico. Emptying has been the more dominant logic throughout that period, from the genocide of the indigenous people to mass migrations in the 21st century. So if we put it in that context, then I would suggest that yes, I mean, better times might indeed come. The second thing I want to underscore is that Puerto Rico is not an island. In at least two fundamental ways. And that's why I also think emptying is such a dangerous trope. The first way it's not an island is that Puerto Rico is part of an archipelago. Vieques, Culebra, Mona, Monito, Deseche, right? But at another level, Puerto Rico is not an island because it has relationships with multiple other locations, forming what we could call an archipelagic configuration. So if we think about it in that term, when people leave Puerto Rico, they're not entirely leaving Puerto Rico, or they're leaving Vieques or Culebra. There are relationships that are pretty thickly constituted, and I'll speak a little bit about that in a minute. And the third thing that I will dwell on a bit more is that the same emptying infrastructure has been repurposed for other things. So the infrastructure and the emptying process is not a linear process, but it gets disrupted from the infrastructure itself outward. So, having said that, I will read. So the first thing I should say is I am new to this conversation of infrastructure. As so many scholars of Puerto Rican Latino studies, granted in humanities, We have paid some attention, I feel, to technology, particularly in relation to music and media studies, but not so much to the concept of infrastructure. Not only did it sound incredibly dry, you know, in some way, but I think to some extent it risks returning us to certain strands of structuralism, you know, including Marxist structuralism, which so many of us have struggled for decades to move from. The infra now located somehow under political economic structure and cultural superstructure, which is not problematic that I'm going to get in right now, but I think it's something worth thinking about a little more. Now, of course, in the aftermath of Maria, drastically changed all of us in all our fields, regardless. So it's not only urban planners or architecture or others in related fields. I've been thinking about this for some time, but I think everybody. This was because, you know, not only there was, you know, coast on the floor, but there were more than 3,000 deaths as a result of declining infrastructure. And this made infrastructure not only a new concept, but also a new trope. And I think this is a bit of another conceptual danger that I'm working through, which has become a trope to narrate everything. You know, a master trope, colonialism, capitalism, political economy, cultural, etc. But as I began working my way through the concept, I saw that rather than the blackout begin this awareness, I feel instead came at the right time to see it as such. And that's because when things fall apart, as Chinua Achebe once put it, infrastructure becomes particularly exposed. And there's no doubt that things are falling apart and being reconfigured, sometimes still with the wires hanging everywhere, and that's not only in Puerto Rico. And when I start reading across disciplines, I actually have to conclude that there is in fact an infrastructure term, not only in fields usually interested in studying infrastructure, but beyond them. And I'll give you two recent examples that I'm trying to work through in the work that I'm doing now. One is from the work of Yannick team, who is developing the concept of infrastructure in the context of a theory of affect. So in texts like The Politics of Affect, team argues that as theories based on reason and rationality are increasingly inadequate to explain a wide range of phenomena, including consumer, cultural production, political behavior, a notion of effective infrastructure is necessary. I just put a picture like this, and I think you can see a point to that. This concept would allow us to inquire into how we make sense of the world through various forms of emotional attachments, rather than the prior concept based on reason and rationality. And also might explain how seemingly contradictory political vocabularies can be binding for the same groups, which is something that's been going on in our national politics for a few years now. A second example that's a bit closer to our topic comes from political scientist Edgardo Melendez's recent book, Sponsored Migrations. The state of Puerto Rican post-war migration to the United States, where he dedicates a substantial chapter to air transportation, titled There Ain't No Buses from San Juan to the Bronx. And he dwells on the importance of this infrastructure to organize what he calls government-sponsored migration. Interestingly, Melendez argues that it's not only infrastructure, but it had to be a certain kind of infrastructure. For instance, it had to be commercial and it had to be safe. A process that only changed the scale of migration, but also the ways that Puerto Ricans would connect to the U.S. and the diaspora, as well as the development of industries like tourism. I mean, a big point that he makes in this chapter is that unlike most people think, air transportation did not come to stimulate tourism, but actually tourism came after infrastructure had to be provided to move migrants from Puerto Rico to the United States. Ultimately, to manage this migration and this movement, the government also approved a number of legislation that in turn created various forms of institutional or bureaucratic infrastructure to make this happen. Now, in my current work, the reason I became interested is in infrastructure in migration studies is that I was wondering, I actually had to answer the question of the speed of emptying after Hurricane Maria. How can we account for the fact that in a very short period of time, thousands, hundreds of thousands of people actually were able to leave? So that it started making me think about elements that are not normally thought about as infrastructure. For instance, US citizenship as a form of infrastructure, because it does not provide very many rights if you live in Puerto Rico, but it does allow for free movement from the island to the United States. So perhaps we also have to think about some aspects of legal system as forms of infrastructure. Of course, actual commercial air transportation, as Melinda suggested, but also, and this is the other part, because I was concerned with the question of how could the federal government get away with this, of not investing in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria. And I realized that another perhaps overlooked element of infrastructure were the Puerto Ricans that were already in the United States, their physical resources and the emotional resources. If it had not been that these 5.5 million people existed in the United States, I wonder if and how this emptying could have happened. So in that regard, these various elements of infrastructure were completely necessary to actually propel emptying as a way to the federal government not support Puerto Ricans on the island after Hurricane Maria and not relieve them during the entire debt crisis period. At the same time, I was interested in how do we use that same infrastructure, or how that same infrastructure was used by the diaspora, repurposing it to other ends. And it is clear that if you can make a very, very long list that indeed Puerto Ricans from the United States mobilized those same resources in order to assist Puerto Ricans, sometimes 3 weeks, many more weeks, months before the federal government actually got to Puerto Rico. I can make a very long list. For instance, Puerto Ricans arrived with blue tarps ahead of FEMA. Puerto Ricans arrived with medicine and medical care ahead of the federal government. And you also have to raise the question of how is that possible, but that's another conversation. The second, working through the emptying island, these were some of the questions that I became engaged that involved the question of the rethinking of infrastructure. And then the second work that I'm doing has to do with art in particular. After curating an exhibit called Puerto Ricans Underwater, I became interested in art infrastructure for 2 reasons. The first reason is that I noticed that the very art that I was including in the show actually was about infrastructure in some ways. Money, finance, physical infrastructure. This is Santurce, the work of Oscar Robles. Salvador Santos' work, which is a chronicle of the debt crisis and post-hurricane crisis, as engaged by photographing debris. All these works I also found, when the question of archive was mentioned, that art was also playing a big role in archiving the crisis in various ways. The larger inspiration for me to become interested in art as infrastructure, however, came from an analysis of the short story by José Luis González, La Noche que volvimos a ser gente, and I won't go into all the details, but I will say that one of the things that he concludes in this short story is that illumination comes from darkness, or from the blackout, which I think is something that artists have very much taken to heart, and I see that I'm done, so I will just show you a few ways that I think art is becoming infrastructure or reflecting on infrastructure. The first is that art infrastructure is in jeopardy in Puerto Rico. This is Celia Sanchez's studio after the hurricane. The second way is the ways that art and infrastructure projects are coming together. This is the Cine Solar initiative of Casa Pueblo. So bringing new technologies of solar energy and combining them with showing of artistic work, and there's also itinerant movie house that moves around. 3 is the ways that art is repurposing and taking crumbling infrastructure. You can see that in the explosion of murals and public art, and the ways that this very process is also a strategy of placemaking in the face of neoliberal emptying of housing. There's a lot of those. And then there's the ways that our collectives are also producing models of autogestion or self-governance on the margins of the state. And it's the ways that was mentioned by the earlier presenter about the ways that public space has become healing space. This is a reflection on the death of Maria, the debate around how many and the recognition of that pain. But one of the things that's interesting here is how art is becoming also an infrastructure for monumentalizing or memorializing things that are events and processes that are being obscured by the state. So lastly, I guess my conclusion would be that when things fall apart, the imagination needs to take over. There's a lot of infrastructure work to do. Barrato.
Hi, first of all, I want to say that I'm really grateful to have an audience to show my work to. I'm grateful to the colleagues that preceded me. They have prepared the soil for us, I have to say. And I'm also grateful to those who invited me to come to this house. It was here where I decided to focus my PhD in Puerto Rico, because it was for me at the same time an exemplary case and an experimental laboratory of US policies that were going to be seen later on in the south of the United States, but also in the what's called now the global south. So I'm very grateful for all of you to be here and to be here. And the second thing I want to say is that I'm going to apologize because there's no way that I can fit 10 minutes what was the work of many years. So I think I have a small strategy to make the time fit, and I will let you know later about it. But I want to start with this image, which was taken 90 years ago. And when I found it in the archives in the University of Puerto Rico, I was fascinated because probably nobody in that picture is alive. And I wish we could speak to them, or they could speak to us of what went wrong then and what's going wrong now, and why haven't we learned enough lessons to avoid it to happen again. Because in this case you see a formal house completely destroyed. This is not the case of a precarious settlement, and it is razed to the ground, and it is what we were going to be witnessing again and again and again in Puerto Rico with the different hurricanes. So that's why I chose this to begin with. And this was my little intro. I'm going to speak about intro. I'm going to just focus on the case studies. I'm afraid I won't be able to get to the second table, which is the relief and policy trends, and I'll jump into the conclusions. But the image that I'm showing to the left, it's also a very telling image of the 50s in Puerto Rico, a time in which the island government was trying to put forward a proposal of how to understand hurricanes and make it a collective project top down from the state. So this is the poster of a film, which is called Huracan, and it's still bearing some of the ideas that, you know, there's this was a rural country that you had to migrate, and there's something human about the hurricane blowing people's lives, which is what I could read in this poster. And it's also related to the way disasters are built in a way by how we humans use space and how we allocate knowledge, resources, infrastructure. So this is my little trick to beat myself with time. This is the end of it. I mean, these are my conclusions. So if I don't get to your conclusions, I'm grateful if you put attention to this. I think that after studying these 3 hurricanes, I have 3 lessons that I want to share with you. One is that we would need critical and multidisciplinary knowledge, long-term, with different systems of knowledge to inform action. Because that's what at the end of the term, at the end of the story, I think planning is about action. So how do we decide to act? I propose that we try to be critical. We try to challenge assumptions and so on. My second lesson would be that we have to focus on what went the pre-existing factors that enable a storm not to be a storm anymore, but to become a disaster. So there's a big difference between what can happen with the same hurricane, earthquake, snowstorm, depending on the place, depending on how information is there, knowledge, what kind of societal grounds are there for people to react to a disaster. And then the last lesson I learned, I think that disaster management, in the case of Puerto Rico and many others, it needs to go beyond the relief decisions that have shaped the island responses. Throughout the 3 cases I managed to study, which meant a change of the island, a very significant change from the island being a Spanish colony to being part of an unincorporated territory of the US to becoming a Commonwealth of the US. So my 3 case studies are a few months after the US took over from Spain, and you can see, if we go back to my colleague Andrés, how street and infrastructure and mobility need to be rethought. In that later image, you see a man riding a horse, and the water is up to the chest. And this was, 1899. So if you just change the vehicles, that's what we saw in the other pictures. We see this recurring crisis of infrastructure, of road and mobility. And the second one is 1928, a few months before the crash of the stock exchange, which was going to ripple over Puerto Rico massively. And it shows a hurricane, San Felipe, that was a source for Nora Seelhurst to write Their Eyes Were Watching God. And it's a massive regional problem that was never seen as a regional problem. It was studied in an isolated fashion, and it was also dealt with in an isolated fashion, as if the same hurricane blowing all across, it's fragmented, and there's this lack of understanding of the region as a cohesive unit, notwithstanding the history of colonialism. And the third picture shows the aftermath of Hurricane Santa Clara in '56, 4 years after the Commonwealth, that being the island government, was set up, in which the major, you can see still this very rural background of poverty that my colleagues were explaining before, the ongoing dependency debate. So with this image, I just want to speak about the asymmetrical relationship of Puerto Rico, and this is a very brave cartoonist in 1915, speaking of Puerto Rico as a small barefoot vendor who was completely dependent on what the US wanted to sell him. Food, arms, tools, and so on. So this is another factor of continuity that is going to show up, and it has shown up during Hurricane Maria. This is more of the same. I'm going to skip them. So I'm going to focus now on what I thought were like withstanding patterns of transformation. And in this case, how the growth engines during the first 2 hurricanes were to depend massively on one export crop, sugar, which meant the complete change of the coastal landscape, complete transformation of areas that were buffers to hurricanes and floods, for example, marshes, ponds, rivers, mangroves, and so on, for the quest of sugar. And once, during Hurricane Santa Clara, the third one by the 40s, when this export was decaying, the economy changed towards a targeted industrialization, institutional reform, and migration, as we saw in the picture of the plains, later on tourism and construction. So at the end, what I could distill from all this time is that for the most part, the economic growth engines were always pushing for vast gains for corporations, and at best, mixed results for lay citizens. And in the second one, you can see the pattern of urbanization all along the coast. This is the path of the strongest hurricanes of the 19th century. And San Juan is disproportionately shown here. It should be a huge dot in comparison to the other. But what this map is saying is that even already by the 19th century, the fate of vulnerability to floods, for example, to coastal floods and to winds and so on, was established. Because most of the cities are along the coast. And this makes the whole urban infrastructure mostly subject to surges, also tsunamis, and so on. And planning and investment, what I studied was that during this, when I started the time period that I started to study until the end, the planning and investment levels were increasing, but for the most part, they were targeting commodities and oftentimes keep U.S. interest very questionable one sometimes, by force if needed, with gradual inclusion of lay citizens. So, for example, the railroad was established not to move people across the island, but to export goods out of the island. And as soon as that model was not effective, it was abandoned, the railroad system. And this is another way in which you can see how infrastructure was, it existed, because it did, but it was not meant to be used for the development of citizens in the same way that it meant to be used for crops and exports and goods and so on. So this is another example of the same debate. These pictures, they are taken 1 year apart. On the left-hand side, you see the refinery model to be built in southern Puerto Rico, and the tax exemptions that we just heard of. Huge environmental degradation, and the vast gains that the government, the US government and the Puerto Rican government were offering these firms. If you look at it, it's one of these mechanisms of entrenching power. Because at the same time that this was happening, on the left-hand side, you see the dock workers on strike protesting because their basic needs were not met. Their salary was not even reaching the basic level. So who was this infrastructure being built for, and what for, is the question that these two images speak of. So there was a great pumping investment, but for the left-hand side, not for the right-hand side, or for the Vieques case that we just saw with my colleague. This is another example of infrastructure throughout the 3 time periods that I started to study. At the beginning, it was a very limited investment, mostly export investment, infrastructure good for exportation, that's what I'm trying to say, such as ports, bridges, lighthouses, roads, and fractional railroad. This increased, but by the 1950s, what we had was, again, a huge investment like this motorway, which helped the gains of private owners and developers. It also privileged individual car transportation over mass transportation. Time is up. And suburban sprawl and compact growth. We see water infrastructure, massive transformation of the island, which would put people at risk with the dams. If you've heard, 70,000 people were relocated due to an emergency last year with the fear that the dam would break. So in a way, it's like the seed of its own destruction, creating a better infrastructure, but with aims of transforming it, of dominating nature, of taming it, which bounces back. So this whole idea of transforming the coastline, also precarious housing towards formal housing, which later on becomes, as I said, extremely vulnerable to floods. It's part of a loop that needs to be critically assessed, because it's not lack of investment. It's what the assumptions behind where did it go, who gained from it, and who didn't gain from it. So I would say those are the basic questions that I want to leave you with. I'm very sorry that I couldn't get to the end of it, but another time. Thank you so much.
So let's open it up for questions.
My concern is that we are speaking, we'll identify the problem, but I don't have a clear picture in my head as to where do we go from here, what has to be done. Some of the things that I hear is there's all kinds of negotiations going on in Puerto Rico because the finances have to be rearranged, and that's part of the problem. And as long as this question remains, we could have the most brilliant people in the world planning for Puerto Rico and all that, but these questions have to be resolved in order for us to go forward. That's my comment, and I was wondering if you can help me with that.
Okay, well, the short answer to your question is what should we do? Everything. Everything. The work that I've done a bit of work documenting or starting to do the work of documenting and understanding the ways that the vacuum of government created an environment where autogestión and self-governance organizations have flourished. So one of the things that I find interesting and important to understand is how these initiatives are proposing new ways of thinking the very questions of how do we go forward or how we resolve things, which is a very different vocabulary and a different scale and raises other questions to what, let's say, the governing elites of Puerto Rico and the United States might do or not do. So in that regard, I would say that anybody that actually wants to become involved in addressing any number of issues that are, the totality of things, can find a way into that, because it is, involving every aspect of life, from the most fundamental, housing, education, food, energy, etc., right? Now, if you're talking about the larger dynamics at play, I think those are a lot more complicated and potentially a lot more frustrating, which raises to me a question that I haven't resolved yet, that I'm working on, which is what is the relationship between these initiatives of self-governance that's defined in so many different ways and the mainstream political structures. That is one of the, I think, elusive questions for me that I don't know if anyone else here wants to comment on that, but I certainly would like to hear what you have to say about that, because I think it's one of the most vexing questions related to your question.
Yeah, I'll comment on that. Cantinflas used to say, "Ahí está el detalle." I think that and sort of pinning on your question and also on part of your answer, is that certainly in Puerto Rico we have seen sort of two systems of governance, let's say, sort of emerge. There is the official governance, usually top-down, sort of structured by the government, etc. And then there is the flourishing of bottoms-up initiatives of autogestión, of self-governance, occurring simultaneously. And sort of riffing a little bit on Monxo's initial statement, one thing that has happened is that we have all, at one point or another, deemed the government and that top-down structure sort of incompetent and unable to sort of really manage. And certainly that was my thought initially as to how things were operating. But sadly, I think that there is a larger menace going on. And it is that what apparently seems like an incompetence, in fact, is a very Machiavellian plan of invisibility in terms of decision-making, the inability to have any sort of sense of transparency of the decisions that are being made on behalf of Puerto Rico, and lack of transparency as to any sort of clear policy or political drive with politics on behalf of the people, with the big people. No? So in fact, what is happening is that there is a very, very, very fast-moving, wholesale distribution of Puerto Rico in sort of a complicit sort of structure between the government of Puerto Rico and investors in the United States. Now, what happens with that alternative strategy, with the myriad of initiatives of autogestión, is that they are lacking a unified sort of policy that is able to structure them as part of a sort of a larger vision of a future for Puerto Rico. And I think that that idea of of how are we able to articulate a vision as to that transformation that you were calling on, about when Puerto Rico is obviously certainly worth saving, and Puerto Ricans are worth saving in Puerto Rico. What form does it takes as an alternate paradigm to the one that we've been living? And certainly all of the bottoms-up initiatives are very important, but they are operating in the absence of that sort of larger. We sort of feel it and sort of have a certain understanding and a certain set of values and agreement to what it should be, but there's still not an articulated vision where we can say, we are building this piece of sort of this larger puzzle in terms of the face of the future. And I think that that's something that's certainly desperately needed today.
And I think that, in answer to your question, and I think part of their answer is this, to put it simply, you have to change policy. You know, this doesn't work. You have to eliminate the Jones Act tomorrow. You know, like there's something that has no real reason of existing. And whether this is the political climate or not to do it, and I have my opinions, that you have to change that, or you're going to find out that you're going to be walking into the same things, no matter. There's loopholes or ways to get out of it. You have to consider changing the Stafford Act, even if you have to fund the agency better. You have to consider allowing a channel for all these private people from the diaspora and from all other ways that have the right agenda to be a part of this recovery process of hurricane and of the debt, and not choose the existing policy, which is like, well, you know what we have at our disposal is just selling the entire Puerto Rico, which is going to leave you in the same place. And that's what they're doing. That's exactly what they're doing. Let's sell everything we got, like it was a bankruptcy, when there's really people that would help. The same way that my colleague over here explained the economical monster that put Puerto Rico, or helped with Puerto Rico by doing it legally, into this crisis, there are a lot of people that would help, but there are other channels. And in the sense of the hurricane, we saw, you know, my organization raised $1 million in less than a month. And we couldn't get into help. We have to go around. It is, I won't be foolish and tell you that there's people bringing $72 billion to pay the debt just to help Puerto Rico like they wanted to help with Maria. But there are ways and policies that can definitely go to that. And the one that we have to just kind of get into the brain of people is that no matter how economics drive it and politics drive it, it's environmental. The food, the hurricanes, the life situation, it's all environmental. I'm not saying that because they're environmentals only, but you have to quantify how much damage or how much we're putting people in peril by being non-environmental in our planning and our strategies, and we have to change policy there. I know it's a frustrating effort because we're maybe not in the right climate for those particular changes, but you can't ignore that. It just has to be.
I think that it was mentioned a couple of times that there is a strong asymmetry between the relations of the U.S. and Puerto Rico, and I think that in changing those relations, which are understood as also mentioned here a couple of times, the idea of a pre-existing condition, which I think is a known truth, right? We have heard of that before in here. The idea that there's a pre-existing that doesn't apply, right? Because it's far back, and the reason that I started at least in 1998 precisely is to say there's a pre-existing condition that is still operating. So it's not something that we can sort of easily override, and I think it has to do with a question of history and education of that body, precisely what taught to sort of mostly subject itself to the colonial mandate. So I think it's, in a way, I think to break the asymmetry, it has to do with rebuild, if there ever was a stronger body politic that will take up on challenges more concrete and real, which are infrastructural, right? And the sort of legal frameworks that are operating the island. And I think that is, for me, sort of the sort of critical turning point for how that can emerge into different models that will take over, coming from self-governance or bottom-up and so on, until perhaps the larger superstructure acknowledges and then changes.
I wanted to add that there's going to be like $100 billion coming to Puerto Rico, right? But there's like a report actually that is recent from the Center for New Economy that shows that 90% of all the contracts have actually gone to firms in the United States.
So I think that we need, as Puerto Ricans, be able to get some of those federal funds. And the conversation right now is that there's not enough CDCs in Puerto Rico. There might be not enough CDFIs that can apply to the scale that might be needed. So there's a lot of like organizations that are like smaller organizations that have not applied perhaps for CDBG funds that need to learn about matching funds and so on. So I think that capacity building is like a big thing. So, and also like how we can get more nonprofits and people putting proposals together. And I think that the planners have a huge role there in community planning. So I think that that's like definitely a solution. And I think that it was Andrés that mentioned that with the autogestión groups, so the idea of maybe creating a cooperative. So there's some of the conversations that are going now because Puerto Rico has a lot of cooperatives. Their system is huge. So what about creating like a cooperative of all these like smaller groups that they can access the funds? So there's a lot of organizing happening, and there's also a lot of conversation about intermediaries, how organizations here in the United States like LIS, like RASA, like Enterprise can actually like help to be able to put like these bigger in scale grants that it will be inclusive of these like smaller groups, maybe can get micro grants and so on. So those are some of the conversations that are happening right now. So how we get the funding and capacity building.
I think that to answer your question straightforward, I think that what we need to do, we have already done it before. And I think that in Puerto Rico and all over the Caribbean, maybe in Vieques, you know, like because there are colonies of Puerto Rico, like we believe that the ocean ends at the beach. Okay, that's the end of the ocean. We see the ocean as disconnecting us from other places. And I think that has to change. And I say that we've done this before because since the arrival of Europeans in the Caribbean, one of the ways, and obviously before that was the case, one of the ways that we were able and people were able to survive was through smuggling and through communication with other islands in the Caribbean. Okay, and so when Frances spoke about emotional infrastructure, that really enlightened my day, because what we've seen here is how infrastructure that are supposed to be dynamics in different realms of life, that bring people together, that facilitate life, that enhance production, and so on and so forth. What happens when infrastructure becomes an obstacle? What happens when infrastructure, instead of promoting a sense of belonging, promotes a sense of solitude? And so one of the things when Frances spoke about emotional infrastructure is this idea, for example, that the diaspora was able, because of its emotional connection and the existing infrastructure that she referred to, like the airplanes and whatnot, like how we were able to connect and to smuggle help in Puerto Rico before the federal government. And so we need to connect with the Caribbean. We need to look beyond our shores in ways that, you know what, other people do. Like, people smuggle drugs, and the drugs business is super successful in Puerto Rico because they ignore all that infrastructure that promotes solitude. I'm not promoting, like, you know, whatever, but it is something that it is done right now. And if drug conglomerates and cartels are able to do it, I think that if we put our political will into it, it's something that can be done. There are forces against it, like we have 500 years of a systematic effort to separate the islands of the Caribbean, but we've always survived in part thanks to the infrastructural disobedience of our people. I think that we need to accept who we are. You know, we are in a way smugglers and people that refuse to be in long distance relationships. You know, like Puerto Rico, amor te dejo amor. You know what? So Puerto Ricans and all people in the Caribbean, like, we refuse to have those emotional relationships be exclusively long distance. So we need to connect in more concrete ways with the other people around us. I feel that the diasporas here, the big urban centers in the United States play a fundamental role, because it is easier for me to connect with someone from Barbuda, from the Virgin Islands, from Trinidad and Tobago here in Brooklyn or in the Bronx than in Puerto Rico. And so I think that part of the solution and part of the smuggling goes through our neighborhoods and our organizing efforts here in the United States.
You mentioned, go ahead. Well, actually, it has to do with that, just briefly. Like, you mentioned the word refusal, so I just want to say that my argument in the Emptying Island is that there's three modalities of refusal that are playing out. One is yo no me quito, I'm not going anywhere. The second one is yo sí me quito, but yo no me olvido. So I think practices of memory, I think, are very important in sustaining any kind of future that Puerto Rico has, not as an isolated island, but an interconnected island, not only to the Caribbean, but also to major locations in the United States and elsewhere. The Puerto Ricans also outside of the United States have also mobilized and support. But I have to say that there's another big problem. We don't have to go into it now, but there's another issue which has to do with the crisis of meta-narratives of coming together, which is that a lot of our categories of coming together are in crisis. And that's, I think, one part of it. And the other part of it has to do with what you were mentioning about capacity building and draining. In our working group on payable debt, we've done some with Monxo and Libertad, we've done some listening tours with activists. And one of the things, number one things that they told us, that we're exhausted. We cannot organize in our community and organize the nation and organize in a broader or greater scale. So although this is a monster problem, but it has many heads, power is not concentrated in one place, so that's why I really want to underscore that anybody that wants to work on this can find a way to work on this. There's multiple ways, from small scale, medium scale, larger scale, from the arts to building bridges. There's a very broad gamut, so we shouldn't be overwhelmed by the complexity or the asymmetries and so forth, but rather look at it that this is a complex problem with multiple points of entry that everyone can participate.
It's great that you said that, because I was going to say the cards are stuck against, in this game, the federal government at this moment and the island government are not going to be the ones pushing forward the progressive agenda by bits and pieces that we spoke about here. So at the moment, one of the things I see clearly is the need to build even more resistance at whatever scale one can find there or one cannot find. But adding to what my colleagues have said, I would put a great emphasis on the building and the diffusion of knowledge. And that's one of the things my research pointed me to, because there's so much knowledge being built on the entire Caribbean region, which is experiencing similar processes, different, similar, dissimilar, but if we go beyond this narrative that colonialism left us, Anglo-speaking countries, Dutch-speaking, English-speaking, and so on, we can find a lot of information and ways of dealing with problems at different scales that would be extremely useful. So when I was doing my archival research, it was completely hard for me to find all the information in one place. And hurricanes are a recurrent drama in the Caribbean, one of the recurring dramas. So I would also focus on storing the knowledge, making it known to others through different means, printed means, the internet and whatever. And it would be one of the things I would push forward, knowing history more, and be it small-scale oral history, or be it the meta-narratives of history that we need to contest or endorse. But this would be also, for me, a cultural project behind that needs to be started on different scales. And there is such an amount of knowledge and know-how that I'm very optimistic that there is a lot to be gained from there. It's just that we need to also focus, no matter what the federal administration is doing or what the island government is doing, as practitioners, as scholars, as students, as whatever, our quest for knowledge, for sharing it, for challenging it, is central for building a different Puerto Rico, one step at a time. I have no illusions on this being a huge transformation I would love to see. But I do have trust in that by looking at this knowledge, by debating it, by sharing it, we have the possibility of seeing all the spaces of hope, which are vulnerable, you know, they're always going to be perfectible. We can always criticize them, but I would bring knowledge and culture and history as one of our big allies. It is a cultural battle also. It's a political battle, an economic battle, an environmental battle, but it's also dealing with history and culture. And there's a lot there to fight for. And it just needs us to, and others to be aware and know it.
Next speaker. I'll take a couple.
I'm very glad that you're saying that, because as we've been preparing our seminar, I've been trying to find, you know, just the ordinary maps, and we make maps all the time, so just to find the ordinary maps that describe what happened in Puerto Rico, and they're really, really hard to find. So just for example, when Katrina hit, we knew the levee failed, the lower Ninth Ward, you know, was the most damaged, and then there were 5 other neighborhoods were more damaged. We knew which populations were most affected. So I'm just curious, is there a narrative like that that you think is useful about Puerto Rico? Was there one population that was most affected? Was there one city that was most affected? Was it part in the north because of the direction? I'm just curious, because even today, and your talks were all really fantastic, and I really learned a lot about, you know, sort of what hasn't been done. But I'm just curious if there's some major narratives that you think would be useful in starting that debate and comparing Puerto Rico to Houston, to New Orleans, etc. Because I don't think that's been done, especially in terms of recovery.
There's some thoughts there. If I didn't use my description as an architect, I would call myself a map maker. But I was too busy filling diesel tanks to make any maps.
Right.
I think that one of the things that and Puerto Rico is still in crisis. You know, it's been a year and some months, but I would say that we are still sort of in a crisis mode to a great extent. But it is important to be able to start 2019 sort of being able to put down some documentation, some reflections on the documentation. There is certainly something that is important to look at cross-crisis, like you mentioned, looking at Katrina and Harvey and Irma and all that. But I think that probably for us it is more important to look at Puerto Rico against Puerto Rico. So there is sort of a mapping back, a layering of those inherent, use a good term, the pre-existing conditions, and sort of where it was. And there is certainly to look at the effect of Maria and sort of what happened to that. But I think that the other one is establishing parameters and standards as to what it should be. And maybe there is sort of a weird thing about doing about projective mapping. You know? The idea of if we had, for example, using some of the terms that I brought in my own, if we had a condition of sustainable mobility, what would that map look like? And be able to sort of have a shifting vision of a place as it was, and certainly looking at history and mapping throughout history. And what happened right before Maria, and what was the situation there? What was the result of Maria, but then projecting it towards the future. Maybe that's part of the link as to how we are able to start formulating a vision about that future that is needed. Just one last comment. I think that with Maria, we had a certain complacency, if that's a word, that we had gone through hurricanes before. And then there was Hugo, and there was Georges, and all this. And all of us thought that somehow or another, we were going to be able to manage it.
Yes.
Or be safe.
Since this is being recorded, I don't use a term that came right into my mind. But no way. This was something that was completely off the charts. And the morning after, we could not even imagine any sort of sense of planning that we could have done for something of that magnitude. So, yes, we had some training, and we knew how we did it in Yuba, and what it meant to be 1 month without electricity at that time, or without water, but certainly nothing of the order of magnitude of what happened here. So this is, to a certain extent, sort of new knowledge that we have to be able to construct through this experience.
So I just wanted to say that I actually find comparisons within and across useful, but Puerto Rico is not a city, although it's a small place, relatively speaking. It's not a city, and it also is, although small, very diverse physically. So you have mountains, and you have coasts, and you have islands that are not, other islands in the archipelago. Therefore, it would be difficult, impossible, because it's done by journalists, or been done extensively by journalists, like treating Puerto Rico almost like it was just a city, when in fact it's one unit, when in fact it's an archipelago with 78 municipalities.
And the condition of the ruralia is completely different from the metropolitan.
So you have rural and urban, you also have coastal and mountain, you have island and other islands. Therefore, producing that type of narrative might be much harder, although it can be done for certain strategic purposes.
Or it needs to take that diversity into account.
But in more nuanced work, it would have to do that. It would have to take the fact that it's not a single city, that although a relatively small place, it is extremely diverse topographically and economically and racially and so forth.
And I think she's just giving you a little. You're going to try to do this, I heard. Yeah, I think you should. And I think what they're telling you is a big key. It's very different. However, one thing that happened, two things here. One thing that happened was we weren't prepared. But let me tell you, we're not prepared now. When the tropical storm Burl came by and it was threatening, became a hurricane, and it was coming, I tell you, we were setting up a makeshift shelter. This is 8 months after Maria. Nobody's ready, really. And we have FEMA in there. And part of the reason is we're ignoring
all the populations.
Well,
rich people, poor people.
Yeah, and I think rich people are a lot more ready because they have a lot more resources. But I think in the mapping exercise that you want to do, one thing that was ignored was that because we were struck with that complacency of people were going to save us and we have all these life. One thing that changed from Hugo to now is technology. So we did have a lot of tools that just didn't work. And the fact that we're not preparing, that mapping will require an extensive digital system that it's not going to work, but it has to be powered. One of the first problems we had was lack of communication. Nobody knew where to bring things. Nobody knew how to map things. You have to preload it in terms of our response. And you have to set the parameters that will let you identify the particularities of the rural areas, the mountains, the offshore islands, and things like that. But it will certainly is going to have to have a deep digital indicator that is resilient with redundancy in communication.
There is a group that is, I don't know which media, because I get emails on meditation too, but it's a group, I think it's called Open Puerto Rico Vieques, that just after Maria hit, they started to produce maps because they were. And the first one of the problem was that there was no base map. And it was in part generated crowdsourced, a little bit here and somewhere else. So I think after that, they have been continuing because they keep receiving notifications. So they are sort of filling gaps, at least as base map for things to be worked out. The kind of thing that can be in a map. Of course, there are so many others that have to do with the emotion and all that there, but there are so many things that they have documented since then, which I think will be a good resource.
If I were to do a map or conceptual maps, I think the unifying theme may be denial. Because when I was doing my research there, what they were saying was clear to me. I felt I was preaching in the desert, you know. It was like, this cannot happen to us. This is Haiti or the Dominican Republic. This is not Puerto Rico. I looked for jobs left, right, and center, and I never got one. I think because jobs are scarce there. But on the other side, because for the most part, people believe in officials, that's what reality showed us, were unprepared. They thought this was not going to happen. So this mapping of denial versus reality, and also the denial, for example, of how the federal government treated Puerto Rico immediately. That's a denial of a humanitarian emergency. Trump throwing paper towels, that's denial of a profound human crisis. The same with the government. So I would map this act of denial versus reality, and I would also map differences, because they were rightly pointing at the differences. So how different municipalities or entities or communities respond to the same problem, that would be interesting for me. It's hard to do, but I think these two things, diverse responses to the same problem and denial, those could be leading lines or narrative of mapping.
In terms of housing, I would say that where the hurricane entered and also the maintenance region, that's where more homes were affected. So it's about like 76% of homes, and also in the coastal regions as well. And I will also look into the poorest towns, not necessarily in terms of population, but those towns that already were hurting because they already had low informal housing. So for example, the town of Comerío, there's also where the river La Plata is, all that area got flooded. So there's already like maps that have been done about some of these. And in terms of comparisons, I would say that at least like in the case that we were looking at, with like about FEMA, and I think that for advocacy that could be helpful as well to look into other areas in the United States, because then you can see like where inequity exists, and you can make the advocacy point of what happened in other circumstances. So I find again comparisons very useful.
Thank you for the presentation, because being in your midst and hearing and feeling all that you went through brings it so closer to my reality than it would watching it on CNN or just hearing about it or reading it in the newspaper. I'm doing research on infrastructural analysis, looking at African American one-room school facilities. And one of the things that brought me here to this conference today was that the topic, of course, unnatural disaster. And just sitting here hearing you say repeatedly the concepts of, pre-existing conditions and the electrical company and not being prepared. And it's the same in the past, the future, and we can project for the future. My question is in terms of infrastructure. How would you explain a Cat 5 in Houston, same Cat 5 in Puerto Rico, and the devastation is just absolutely phenomenal in difference in everything that you see or speak about? And today, I heard you say something about pre-existing conditions. So knowing Houston, I was telling people, and I'm a Texan, I live in New York, but I'm a Texan. And when they were all upset about what was going on in Houston, I immediately said, Houston is going to be okay, because we have 3 presidents from that state, 2 living now, Senior Bush and Little Bush. They're living there. I mean, I knew that Houston was going to be okay, even with that Cat 5. But when I heard that same Cat 5 in Puerto Rico, I really shuddered because of the infrastructure. Now, what is being done to look at? We can be specific. This lady over here said we can do a lot and a little, but in terms of infrastructure, my research looks at schools, roofs, windows, and floors. How would we begin to make sure that schools operate with the infrastructure that you had then and that you have now, and how do you project it changing in the future? That against the backdrop of unnatural disaster. Are we just having a day to eat this food? Or can you come up with something?
One second, let me see if there are other questions in the room before the last day of the panel. Yeah?
No, I didn't want to interrupt.
Whatever, there are 10 minutes. So.
Yeah, no, quick, I'll say something just after that.
Okay, go ahead.
Yes, I would say that there was like lack of planning. So the actually plan that was done for emergency response, it was like about a tsunami, and it was a plan that was outdated. So FEMA wasn't prepared, so it didn't have the things that needed in order to respond, even though he approved this plan. So I think that planning is like, in terms of emergency, it wasn't there. So that's something that you mentioned. In terms of like the infrastructure that existed, we had like, for example, in terms of the just the electric company, right, with PREPA, so everything was outdated, like 50 years ago when investments were made, 80% of like the cables just like fell down. So again, it was having the lack of investment for a very long time. In terms of the schools, well, that's a interesting piece because the governor just like closed 300 schools, and the majority in rural areas. So in terms of the whole like educational system is being restructured, right? So the question is now what's going to happen with these vacant buildings. A lot of people have been doing community resilience centers because they can put like power on them, they can put cisterns and being ready for another emergency. Other people have been taking it for housing. Some people already have been squatting for a while, right, in schools. So we have to figure out what to do with all these closed schools. So that's like one piece of it. And in terms of the education is being completely dismantled. So there's a lot of cuts to the University of Puerto Rico and to schools themselves. So that seems like another man-made disaster. I don't know what is the solution in terms of education. What the governor is seeing is like charter schools and just like the privatization of the educational system. So it has been kind of like a movement that we have seen in many other cities. So I don't have an answer. I don't know if anybody does, but I just wanted to mention that piece of education.
Yes, I think that the government has been a real hurricane in terms of education in schools in Puerto Rico. What the hurricane didn't take with it, the government has done it. So I think that in terms of infrastructure, the real problem there is evidently the policies and the closing of schools and so on and so forth, rather than the hurricane.
I think with Vieques is again a microcosm. FEMA decided that they were going to do a new grid over Vieques that could handle Cat 4s, maybe Cat 5s, and then put some underground and put rural utility standards that would hold, and there wouldn't be like a piece from 1960 and another from 1970. It happened on most rural places in Puerto Rico that haven't somewhat changed it. It was just really crappy grid. But when they're presented these options, the electric company wants to have the money to do it themselves, not an outside company from the United States or even other in Puerto Rico, but they're not trusted by anybody who's funding because they're not known for their money management. But in the schools, in Vieques, for example, we see what is transferable to all that. You would think they would go to the schools and hook them up and make them resilient and all that, but that's just not the case. So the answer is like, Puerto Rico has to revisit the entire grid and make it sustainable to categories. And the federal government should pay for it if they're smart, because if not, they're going to be rebuilding it all the time. And that's why, I mean, the Stafford Act has to bend a little bit, so you don't have to find these weird sources of money to fix a problem that you know you're going to have. And then you have to apply it to the schools. In Vieques, when Burl came, we were outfitting a school as a secondary shelter because they weren't ready, and the school wasn't ready. Private people.
Going back to the U.S. citizen as the infrastructure of travel and mobility, what about Puerto Rico is oddly enough one of the places that most of the population votes, like 80%, I think, which is, but then with the new diaspora that's been happening in Florida and the election that just happened, what has been because that's a really prosaic but very evident way of going about the problems, the policy problems. So what is the voting rate of the new diasporas getting to Florida and places like that and taking advantage of that U.S. citizenship infrastructure to move to places and change those policies through the systems that already exist?
I scratched all that part of my paper, but I can tell you what I used to say. I just want to say that a brief answer to your prior question, that there's not going to be, what you're asking, is there going to be a systemic rebuilding of Puerto Rico according to what we have learned? No. What there's going to be is a good old Marxist concept, desigual y combinado, right? There's going to be an unequal a process of rebuilding depending on the resources, networks, and other capabilities of different parts. I think that's what's going under current conditions. Under current conditions. If there was other kinds of political developments, other things might happen. To Libertad's cuestionamiento.
Uno ni el otro, sino todo lo contrario.
One or the other, but the opposite.
To Libertad's question, actually I've been following the Florida situation. There's a lot of hope. I think the Florida situation is also desigual y combinada. You don't have the same levels of voting anywhere, Puerto Ricans in the U.S. than you have in Puerto Rico, and that's because in Puerto Rico your job may depend on your vote. It's a whole different reality. Nothing to do with citizenship or any of that. And the other thing though is that particularly Florida, I think that's a big question mark. I see reasons to be optimistic and pessimistic about the future of Florida, Puerto Ricans politically. On the optimistic side, we've seen things in Florida happen as a result of Hurricane Maria's settlement that we hadn't seen before, like protests to governors. Like there was a protest, people protesting Rosselló when he went to Kissimmee and calling them Vende Patria, people are suffering, etc., etc. That kind of stuff you didn't, not normally see in Florida. But on the other hand, Florida is a place, and I lived there for 7 years, is a place where neoliberalism is the lingua franca, is dominant ideology internalized. You have to pull yourself up from the bootstrap, the government's not responsible for you, etc., etc. In that regard, I think that in the long term, Puerto Ricans will diversify politically, and although the majority may still be relatively progressive, I think it's not going to be a bloc the way that some people would like it to be or behave as.
Well, I think the opportunity that you're identifying is the only thing that's going to get some policy change here. In Vieques, we didn't get power. So all these people got together, Voices for Action for Vieques, and called 32 people in Congress and Senate every day. And the Army Corps of Engineers showed up immediately. That's not the way it should work. But in terms of the policies, Because why should we get benefit that we have people calling over Comerío? I mean, I'm glad we got it, and we were being abandoned, so it's timely, and I kind of feel that it's okay because everybody else is kind of being attended to. But in terms of what you're saying, there is a strong, not only the Puerto Ricans who are there, but people who care about Puerto Rico still have Maria in their minds to the elections and to the that are going to be coming up and to the decision making. So I would make a major push to change some of these policies, to get some of these resources, because it's going to affect the elections if we keep clear into what is needed. We're going to confuse it with political, we could keep on infrastructure and improvement and education and all these things very clearly, very single trick pony there. I think you do have the power with the people who moved to Puerto Rico to the States and with the people in the States that remembered Puerto Rico.
But you need a massive organizational, I mean, if you think about Vieques as an example, massive investment, you would need a massive political investment.
Or a great movie.
At many levels, in order to do that.
Well, I'll just say thanks. I don't want to, just to wrap up, but first of all, thank you everybody for an amazing conversation. But I just want very quickly, nobody necessarily needs to answer this, but maybe you have some thoughts. To return to some of the points that Jacob made at the beginning. You all just gave us kind of chapter and verse the neoliberal script in one way or the other, including in the Q&A. And to my mind, you showed us what is not so much exceptional about this particular case, but what's typical about it. And not just with hurricanes, but, for example, Detroit, we mentioned Flint. Sites of dispossession, they usually map onto some kind of either colonial or other sort of cartographies, comparable Indo-colonial cartography or exo. And so what seems to be new, maybe, is this moment of emergency, this sort of declaration that all bets are off, and most particularly the way that this works on suspending exactly the processes you just described. It is heartening to hear more about the sort of self-governing movements and so on, but particularly the way in which democratic institutions are suspended in order for this other restructuring to happen seems to be a plan. So in a way, I guess one of the things that you've confirmed for me, and maybe you have some closing thoughts, is that not only is the plan not to have a plan, but the point of that is to attack directly those institutions and those, popular democracy, even formal democracy, just sort of, that may get in the way of the bankers and so on. So at one level, yes, it may be about who's running the show, but that is maybe the more infrastructural element, that there are operating systems running in the background that in a sense, drive the whole project, anticipate climate change, anticipate economic restructuring, and plan accordingly. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that. You don't have to, but.
I'll add another sort of lesson, certainly for me, in terms of the overall title and perhaps the expectations of the conversation. Certainly there's the issue of the urgencies that you mentioned. And the other one, which is not to abuse of Rosselló crowds, but it's the idea of infrastructure as an expanded field. That the common thought of infrastructure as the hard, very, very, very technical underpinnings of the built environment, to hear the idea of emotional infrastructure, to hear about history as infrastructure, that sort of supports sort of the economic systems that sort of underpin the trajectory of how certain things, how we can understand how certain things happen over time. I think that all of those are, and maybe my own public spaces infrastructure, are all sort of enriching the conversation, making it certainly much more complex than how do you fix grids and how do you establish capacities for the future, but something that is much richer, much more complex, much more wicked as a Gordian knot in terms of a problem that we have to confront. And certainly I think it's something, it's a benefit of having been here and being able to hear all of those sort of added complexities to our own very sort of wickedly complex home that we call Puerto Rico.
Yeah, and we'd like to thank you for bringing us. I think part of it is what you said. There has to be an organized, massive movement that takes the opportunity that Maria brought within its horror to highlight these typical situations and to push for change. So I think the more we all do it in all the different ways, we have a short window, very short window.
Okay, thank you everyone. This was amazing.